And we are live. I'm so excited today. I've got an amazing guest for you with over 900 scientific papers, 8 books, and 3 decades of Ivy League experience. Avi Loeb is at the top of his game in the astronomy and astrophysics worlds. By one quantitative metric that scientists and scholars use to measure their success, the H index, a value of a 12 is considered good enough to secure university tenure. 20, a sign of notable success. 40, representative of an outstanding scientist. Avi Loeb boasts an H index of 112. Avi, I hope I didn't embarrass you with that introduction.
Well, these labels do not impress me at the very least, because I'm still the farm boy. If you ask people that know me from a young age, they will tell you I haven't changed much. And, what really, we should keep our eyes on the ball, not on the audience here.
Absolutely. So speaking of keeping our eyes on the ball, the recent report was finally released from the Pentagon, specifically the preliminary assessment of unidentified aerial phenomena from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Avi, I realize that this is a preliminary report and only a tiny piece of a much longer classified version, but what did you make of the scope of the report and how it was compiled from a scientific perspective of good data collection and analysis?
Well, first thing to understand is the report originated from concerns about national security. Of course, if we have objects flying in our sky, we need to understand where they come from. And that's why it was of interest to the military. It was of interest to Washington, D.C., the political system. And the fact that we see this report coming out in public implies 2 important things. First, that the report states that some of the objects appear to be real. And the reason they are believed to be real is because they were detected by radar systems, infrared sensors, optical cameras, and then multiple people seeing the same thing. And so you can't argue, like some people on Twitter argue, that it may be a smudge on the camera, it may be a malfunction of an instrument, it may be the illusions of some pilots. And by the way, these are people we trust for the defense of our country. So you can't just dismiss those serious people. And by the way, we put people in jail based on 2 eyewitnesses that testify that they saw something. So apparently our legal system does believe people when they come out and say, that's what I've seen. And so we should pay respect to those military personnel that talk about these incidents. And the other thing the report says is there was a stigma on discussing this subject because people were afraid of the taboo on the context of an extraterrestrial technology and so forth. And as a result, the number of reported incidents is far smaller than the actual number of events that took place. But the most important statement, as far as I'm concerned, is that some events are real, some objects are real. And also you see that some high-level officials, such as the former CIA directors Brennan and Woolsey and former President Barack Obama, were talking about these as a serious matter. And those people had access to the classified data, which I think is the iceberg. We just see the tip of the iceberg. So when people criticize the images that we see, they have to understand that there is much more data available, and it's not being released because it was collected by sensors that are owned by the US government, and those sensors are classified. And because of that, the data is classified. If you were to reveal all the data, it would basically tell our adversaries what kind of instruments we're using to monitor our sky. And obviously these instruments are of national security importance, so we don't want to do that. Now, here is a simple path forward. The data that was reported is intriguing enough, at least to me, to suggest that we move this subject away from the talking points of politicians or national security advisors or military personnel to the realm of science. It's sufficiently intriguing for scientists to look into it. And the sky in many geographical locations is not classified. We can look up and monitor the sky. So, and in fact, we don't need to use government-owned instruments. We can buy off-the-shelf cameras connect them to wide field telescopes, and feed the data that we get into state-of-the-art computers. And these instruments will be far more capable, actually, than what you find in airplanes, because
it's
those
designed for the purpose, right?
Yeah, the fighter jets were designed for combat situations. They were not really aimed at collecting scientific data on unidentified aerial phenomena. So the obvious step forward would be for scientists to take the charge and monitor the sky in those geographic locations or others, and collect data that will be open to the public using scientific instruments that are far better than those used by the military, and analyze this data to figure out whether there is anything unusual. And if there is, let's just get a high resolution photograph of these phenomena. That will resolve the question. It's not a philosophical question of whether we are alone, whether there is a smarter kid on the block. It's not a subject for discussions on Twitter. It's basically getting a high resolution photograph so that we can see the screws on the object and figure out what it means. Now, if it turns out that it's human-made and it was made by Russia or China, and we haven't anticipated that, then it's clear that there is a national intelligence crisis, because we did not expect that. And we pretty much know the limits of our technologies, and we pretty much know the limits of other people's technologies, because if there was a technology far more advanced than we currently possess, it would find its way to the consumer market, because you can make a huge profit out of it, or it will find itself in the battlefield, and we would see some signatures of that. So I highly doubt that there is something out there that is far better than we expect. And my point is, if these objects, these phenomena, behave in ways that far supersede our technological limits, and they are real objects, then there are two possibilities left. Either they are natural phenomena that we haven't anticipated, or they are extraterrestrial technologies. And both of these possibilities would be exciting. It's a win-win proposition. We will learn something new. So how can scientists ridicule this subject and say, let's forget about it, business as usual? That's the wrong thing to do. What we should do is organize a scientific project that will clear up the fog, that will tell the public what the nature of these objects is. Science in the 21st century can address such questions. We are not in the Middle Ages and Dark Ages where people had convictions and talked about miracles. We have scientific instruments that can tell us the nature of objects, and we can figure out what they are. And that will be a contribution of science to society, because a lot of people in the public are curious about this subject. And just like science helped design a synthetic chemical that produces the desired immune response in the bodies of hundreds of millions of people, and solve the COVID-19 problem with the mRNA
vaccine
solution. Science can also prove itself very useful to address this particular question that is of great interest to the public. And I'm very optimistic that if funding is allocated, we can do it. And in fact, I'm being contacted about the potential funding sources.
Well, Avi, if you're optimistic, I'm optimistic, and that makes me feel great. You said so many amazing things there, and I want to break some of those down. The first thing I want to break down is the debrief. Chris Plain with the debrief released a story today about one of the things that you mentioned. He spoke with a leading astrobiologist, Abel Mendez from the Planetary Habitability Lab, and he was quoted as saying, it's a moot point when asked about whether or not he would work with NASA or work with the government to begin to understand what we have, what we're looking at. He said it's a moot point unless NASA can get its hands on the classified UFO data held by the Pentagon. Are you concerned that the classified data will not be shared with scientists?
Well, I think it's the wrong approach altogether, because rather than obsess with classified data and argue with politicians, you have to understand, politicians and military personnel, they're a different brand of people. It's just like going to shoemakers and saying, please bake me a cake. These people are not, do not have the education of scientists. They cannot really provide the answers for what we want to know. And I think what we should do is collect new data. I mean, science is about reproducibility of results. We don't need to rely on the government to tell us what we see in the sky. We can rely on the government on policy matters. That's very important, but not on objects that we see in the sky. That's ridiculous for us to dig into a fight with people that hold classified information about things appearing in our sky. We can look at the sky with scientific instruments. I mean, I just don't find this making any sense. And moreover, there are people reminiscing about the past and so forth. I would like to say that UFOs are probably a mixed bag. There were lots of eyewitness testimonies that talked about seeing something unusual. Many of them have probably mundane explanations because people saw something that belongs to the military and they didn't know about it. So for them, it was unidentified. For the military, it was completely identified. So it doesn't vindicate all these claims of the past. When we see something in the sky, it doesn't say that all the previous reports about things in the sky are of value. And it doesn't really matter, because if we collect exceptional data, all we need is one object, just one object. I don't care about hundreds, thousands, or millions of objects that other people talked about. That is irrelevant. All we need is good data on one object, a high-resolution image or some other data that implies we are dealing with an object that doesn't behave the way our technologies allow, and that represents possibly an advanced technological equipment. And by the way, the most likely contact that we will ever have at first is probably with equipment. It's not with biological creatures the way you see in science fiction, because living organisms cannot survive the journey between stars. It's a very long journey. It takes 4 years for light to reach the nearest star to us, and it takes tens of thousands of years to traverse the galaxy for light. And most spaceships move, the spaceship we produce so far, propelled by chemical rockets, these are at best reaching a speed of 10,000 times less than the speed of light. So multiply the duration by a factor of 10,000. So to reach the nearest star, it takes tens of thousands, like 40,000 years to reach the nearest star with New Horizon. And to reach the edge of the galaxy would take us, instead of tens of thousands, it will take us hundreds of millions of years. And that is a long time. You need many generations of any biological creature. It doesn't make any sense. You would send equipment that can survive the journey, that doesn't get bored, and it could be equipped with artificial intelligence. We already have systems of AI that perform better than humans. So just imagine an AI system that makes its own decision, learns from its experience, just like through machine learning. We already have that, and makes it's completely intelligent the way you are expecting a human being to be, but it's made of electronics, and it makes decisions that could outsmart us. And by the way, we might need our own AI systems to interpret their AI system. It's sort of like going to our kids and telling them, could you explain to me what I found on the internet? And just because the kid is much more skillful in dealing with computers, So our AI system we might not understand how the AI system arrived to that conclusion, because it may be very complex, but our AI system may advise us as to what is the meaning or what is the intent of their AI systems. So I think the most likely situation for us to have a contact is with an AI system, and it could be equipped by other things like a 3D printer so that it can replicate itself. It can produce many copies. Once it lands on a planet like Earth, it will not be the only one. It can make more copies. And who knows? But the point is, our imagination is limited by what we were able to produce so far. So that's why I'm talking about AI and 3D printers. It might be something completely unexpected for us. And that's why we should not have a prejudice and not limit our imagination. And what I find really strange is that the general public has its heart in the right place. The general public says, that's exciting. Let's see what's happening out there. And the scientists just ridicule it, and they look at each other and make fun of it. I just don't understand this approach, because if you look at the history of science, a century ago, quantum mechanics was discovered and was completely unexpected. It was discovered experimentally. And Albert Einstein, of course, didn't have Twitter back then, so he didn't ridicule it, but he wrote papers saying, I don't believe the premise of quantum mechanics. I don't think it can have spooky action at a distance. He dedicated months and years to argue against some of the fundamental interpretations of quantum mechanics. And he was wrong. And now, a century later, it's still stuck like a bone in the throat of physicists. We don't fully understand quantum mechanics, but the instruments that we use, like the instruments that the two of us are using to communicate, everything, the computer that we use, the camera that we use, everything is based on our understanding of quantum mechanics. I can give you a list of hundreds of items within the instrumentation that both of us use that reflect the use of quantum mechanics along the past century. There were all kinds of inventions based on quantum mechanics that allowed us, the two of us, to speak right now, and for other people to listen in. But my point is that it was a complete surprise. It's clearly a facet of reality. That's what reality is. So what is the lesson that we draw from that? That sometimes when you see something anomalous, something that is not expected, you should not ignore it. I just don't understand why anomalies are unpopular. As far as I'm concerned, in my book, actually, and that's a metaphor, but it's also true in my actual book, Extraterrestrial, anomalies are the most exciting things you can find in your scientific career. Because if you find an anomaly and it's real, it's based on real data, then it's nature's way of educating you. It's nature's way of telling you, look, you've been missing something. Try to figure it out. Think twice. But instead, what you see from the scientific community is, oh, forget about it. People make jokes and they get a lot of likes on Twitter by making jokes of anyone discussing anomalies seriously, and just say, oh, I don't know what it is, but let's forget about it, business as usual. And they give it a chance of 0 to be anything interesting. Like what? I mean, how did we get this attitude?
I don't know. It's almost as if there's this status quo bias in mainstream academia, where it's more interesting or entertaining somehow to be within the average, as opposed to be looking at the anomalous activity that we're seeing that doesn't, if it doesn't match my statistics and the data point screws up my math, then I'm not going to look at it, or I don't respect it. And it's really frustrating. You see guys like Neil deGrasse Tyson right now on Twitter just blasting this effort to get more data. And I just wonder where the intellectual curiosity is. Sarah here mentions, Dr. Loeb, thank you for everything you do. What factor has most impacted or changed the way you view UAP over the last few years?
Well, it's basically evidence. I'm a scientist and I respect evidence. I think all these people that ridicule anomalies, they're betraying the tradition of science. They're also betraying their childhood curiosity, because, they're all born as kids, and kids wonder. And somehow along the way, these people lost their curiosity and started worrying about their image and about how many likes they get on Twitter. All these people that you see ridiculing, they just look around and try to get more likes on Twitter, rather than looking at the evidence and saying, look, this is unusual. Let's find out by getting more evidence what these things are. And by the way, if it happens to be a natural phenomena, so be it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's something unexpected. If it happens to be the Russians or the Chinese, that's extremely important, because then it says we have a problem with our national intelligence. If it happens to be extraterrestrial, that would change the course of history. So how can you, just as a serious person, ignore that? Now, the surprising fact from the report is that Washington, D.C. is starting not to ignore it. It starts to pay attention to it. But then you look at scientists and some of them still ridicule it. Now, that shows something about the health of the intellectual culture in academia. Because I'm saying not only you're not supposed to ridicule it, you're actually supposed to jump at it and say, wow, that's fascinating. I'm really curious to figure out what it is. This is an opportunity for us to learn something new. And even if you have a prejudice that it's natural, even if you think that Oumuamua, this object that was discovered in 2017, is natural in origin, and there were 4 suggestions in the literature for what kind of origin it could come from, and one of them was a nitrogen iceberg, another one a hydrogen iceberg, another one a cloud of dust particles, things that we've never seen before that have major flaws in the interpretation. But even if that's the case, it will, if we explore it and find another object that happens to be a hydrogen iceberg that we've never seen before, that would tell us that instead of seeing rocks of the type that we've seen in the solar system, there are nurseries that produce objects that are much more abundant than rocks that float in space. And we learn something new. We didn't expect that. We don't expect nurseries of hydrogen icebergs to populate the galaxy with more, like by orders of magnitude, more hydrogen icebergs or nitrogen icebergs than normal rocks. If we look at the solar system, we don't see such things. We just see rocks. So how come so that will teach us something new. So I'm saying, okay, let's accept the mainstream view that it's natural in origin. Even, that would argue for us to explore it rather than ridicule any unusual or non-conventional explanation like an artificial origin. We should explore all possibilities. If we have a photograph, a high-resolution photograph, it could tell us if it's a nitrogen iceberg or if it's artificially produced. And all I'm saying is, let's get that photograph, both in the case of UAP and in the case of Oumuamua-like objects. And anyone, the biggest mistake we can make is ignore it, say business as usual, ridicule the people that discuss non-conventional interpretations, and not get the data. And that obviously will confirm our bias, our conviction. It will be similar to what happened to the philosophers that refused to look through Galileo's telescope. They said, we know that the sun moves around the earth. They put Galileo in house arrest. Nowadays, they would cancel Galileo on Twitter. That would be the convention. And they maintain their ignorance. But reality doesn't really care about that. The earth continued to move around the sun, irrespective of whether it was recognized by the philosophers or not. And the same thing is true about neighbors. Whether we have neighbors or not doesn't depend on whether we look through our windows. We might decide to close off the curtains and say, oh, we are the smartest and we are the only ones around, not look through our windows. That wouldn't change reality. It would just make us ignorant. And guess what? One day we will hear a knock on the door, and that indeed would be an extraordinary evidence, like you are seeking extraordinary. You open the door, you see someone else. Fine, but then it will be too late for us to respond in a way that is well planned. And if you want to understand your place, the environment that you live in, you want to have that information in advance. That's what science is about. Any knowledge is useful. You can't argue for ignorance. In my latest essay to Scientific American, I basically said ignorance is like the number 0. The product of ignorance with any item gives you no content whatsoever. So it helps you to maintain your convictions, but it doesn't promote a better future. You want to understand the reality that you live in. You don't want to be ignorant. But humans in principle can be ignorant forever. They can decide, we know the answer, we don't want to deal with anything else. We will ridicule anyone that considers things outside the box. And as a result, we will remain ignorant. That's a choice. And in principle, the scientific community can make that choice to remain ignorant on this issue. And that's a choice that is being made right now.
Right. It's fascinating because this even came up specifically in the report. The report says sociocultural stigmas and sensor limitations remain obstacles to collecting data at UAP, although some technical challenges, such as how to appropriately filter out radar clutter to ensure safety of flight and military civilian aircraft, are longstanding in the aviation community, while others are unique to UAP problem set. We've got a problem in the military, and this is beginning to change. The culture is beginning to change. We got people like Alex Dietrich coming out, who was with David Fravor when they were involved in the Tic Tac incident in 2004. for. She's coming out not because she wants to or she's excited to, but because she wants to help overcome the stigma, the ridicule, the things that are associated with people coming forward. When Fravor came back to that ship on that day, he was the laughing stock of the ship. This is a problem. And whether or not it's foreign technology, whether or not it's extraterrestrial technology, whether it's not an atmospheric phenomena, something is going on, and that needs to be reported and studied analytically.
Yeah, and my point is it now needs to move to the realm of science. And I think, if I were to be engaged or lead a scientific project on this matter, we can pretty much clear it up. We can figure out the nature of these objects the way that scientists do. We collect data with state-of-the-art instruments off the shelf, not government-owned, so the data will be open to the public. We will analyze it in a way that will be open to the public, and we'll figure out the nature of these objects. And, as a physicist, I can pretty much deal with any data that will come along and try to see if we can explain it one way or another. I think it's the wrong approach to try to retrieve the data from the government at this point. All we needed from the government is the admission that they have enough data to indicate some of the objects are real. And to me, that is the most significant aspect of the report. And from there, we take the message and we move into a new reality where we collect the data. Science is about reproducibility of results, and we collect it in an open fashion so the public would know exactly what is going on, and we approach it in a brave way. Now, obviously, whatever we find, I'm not afraid of, because knowledge is always good. We want to understand where we live. Just feeling that we are the smartest and would be similar to my daughters when they were young. They stayed at home and they thought that they're the smartest in the world because their world was our home. But when they went to the kindergarten on the first day, they had a psychological shock to realize that there are kids that might be smarter than they are. And obviously, if I were to ask them, they would say, we prefer to stay at home. But I think for our civilization to mature, we really have to face reality.
Absolutely. It's interesting because even in the report on page 2, it says the DNI, in consultation with the Secretary of Defense, is to submit an intelligence estimate of that posed by unidentified aerial phenomenon, and the progress of the Department of Defense Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force had made in understanding this threat. And obviously, if they're approaching it from a threat narrative, it's very difficult to study it as open-minded, because there is still a bias if you are studying it from this threat bias perspective. So I really appreciate the fact that you want to take it out of the military industrial complex and study it from a scientific perspective without any sort of bias, including that threat bias.
Right. There is, beyond figuring out the nature of these objects, suppose they are extraterrestrial in origin. Suppose we find such one object. We don't need many, just one. Then the next question is, what is the intent? And that is extremely important. As you remember, there was this story about the Trojan horse that from the Greek mythology, where the city of Troy trusted and let in, and then the purpose of that Trojan horse ended up being different than originally conceived. And so I think we should collect as much data as possible. If we find a piece of equipment hovering in the sky that came from another civilization, just to see first what kind of data it is seeking. And then, of course, we can do something and see how it responds to that. And at the end, we might engage with it. But I don't think, if you look at human history, engagements that were constructive, like based on trade, ended up being much more beneficial than engagements that led to destruction, like wars. If you look throughout history, societies or nations that tried to trade with each other benefited far more than societies that went into war. And if they are intelligent, they would recognize that and not necessarily destroy everything they see. Right? They will think about the benefits of using our resources or whatever. As I said, they have no chance of communicating with whoever sent such equipment because of the large distances involved and the time it takes. So There are
unless Oumuamua is beaming the radar data back to the sensor data back to the home civilization.
Well, so that's something I discussed in a recent Scientific American essay that is still the most popular on their webpage after a week and a half. The idea was that originally I thought Oumuamua must be very thin because it's being pushed by reflecting sunlight, so it's probably a light sail or something. But then now I came to think if the UAP are real probes that were sprinkled on Earth a long time ago, perhaps the shape, the structure of Oumuamua being very thin and the size of a football field and flat, perhaps that shape indicates that it was a receiver. It was tumbling every 8 hours and looking in all directions and trying to receive some information like a dish. And perhaps it was communicating with some of these probes. So that's a possibility. I'm not saying that there is any evidence for it. I'm just saying it may well be that the excess push away from the sun just told us that it's an artificial object, that it's very thin. Nature doesn't make such thin objects. And in fact, in September 2020, the same telescope in Hawaii that discovered Oumuamua discovered another object called the 2020 SO, which happened to be a rocket booster from a 1966 launch from Earth. And we know that it was not designed to be a light sail. Nevertheless, it exhibited an excess push away from the sun, reflecting sunlight, without a cometary tail. And the reason for that is that it had thin walls. So it was designed for a completely different purpose as a rocket booster. And nevertheless, it was very thin. And the same might be true for Oumuamua, that it was thin, not because it was a sail, but it served a different purpose.
Right. That's fascinating. This is an amazing question from Lou. If Avi had an unlimited budget, what would be your first experiment to collect data for UAP analysis?
Oh, very simple. I would use state-of-the-art cameras. I will use as much budget. I mean, obviously, it can.
Whatever they'll give you, right?
Well, yeah, as much as I'm getting, and to have the best telescopes, the largest size, a number of telescopes in different locations connected to state-of-the-art cameras, and then monitor the sky, basically survey the sky, and that would produce an enormous data stream, because there are so many pixels looking at the sky all the time that and that would allow us to, in principle, just preserve the features that are of interest if you connect the data stream to a computer system that filters it, that analyzes it, and just keeps things of interest. And I should emphasize that it's very different from an astronomical observatory that usually focuses on distant objects that don't move much on the sky. So here we are focusing on nearby objects that move a lot on the sky on a short time scale. So for astronomy, that's a nuisance. If you see something like that, you say, oh, it's a satellite. Oh, it's, maybe it's a spy satellite that we don't know about. We will just ignore it. And so there is, for example, a survey planned 2 years from now on the Vera Rubin Observatory in Chile that is now in the final construction phase. And we'll start operations in 2 years. And that will be LSST, a survey dedicated to monitoring the sky. It's a big facility that will collect a lot of data. But one of the problems for that facility is the constellation of communication satellite, Starlink, that SpaceX is launching right now. There could be tens of thousands of them. And I chair the board on physics and astronomy of the National Academies, in which we heard reports about the risk and the problem of those communication satellites flying overhead. And then the proposal came to paint them black. And that proposal was made to SpaceX, and they're planning to do that. But even those black painted communication satellites, the size of a person roughly, even those would still be visible, but they will not be too shiny because they reflect sunlight even at night, and they create streaks of light on the sky as they move across the sky. So my point is, if we can see those black painted, dark painted communication satellite with LSST on the Vera Rubin Observatory, we might as well see almost any object moving above us in the same field of view. And I think, astronomers, if they were not aware of this interest in UAP, they would just dismiss those things and just clear out the data, because some of these satellites may not be ours, they may be from other nations. We will not know when they're passing overhead. On the other hand, a search for UAP is actually focused on these things. It's supposed to find all these UAP. And we can tell if it's a satellite or something passing closer. And we can do a much better job than Dietrich or Fravor did. Obviously, I trust what they say, very much so. I believe them. But I would like it to be recorded by instruments so that we get more data. We get not only the information about the object and perhaps a high-resolution photograph of the object, but also we get the side effects. If an object moves very fast, we might get a shock, a sonic boom or something. I want to see the side effects because they will say something about the nature of the object. So as a scientist, when you do an experiment, there are lots of things you're looking for. And that's why I'm excited to potentially have such a program. So if I had, coming back to the question, if I had an infinite amount of money, I would build this infrastructure of telescopes with cameras connected to computer systems and collect the data, all the data that we can from monitoring the sky over and over again for a long period of time, and then looking for unusual things, analyzing them, and trying, the goal is to get a high resolution photograph of one of these objects, because if we can see the screws on the surface of the object, that would tell us a lot. We might even read off the label made on planet X.
Right. It's interesting because you bring up this this great point about analyzing that data, and you also bring up an amazing point about AI. And I don't know if you know this or not, but the Chinese, when they put together their task force within the last few weeks, they actually stated that they were going to be using AI to track these objects. I do wonder, however, if these are, let's hypothesize for a moment. Let's imagine that these things are coming from another planet and they are AI systems. They're not biological systems. Do you think they wouldn't? I mean, my interpretation would be they may very well have sensors or abilities to avoid detection, jam signals. Even David Fravor said that his signals were jammed in the Tic Tac incident, and he actually considered that an act of war. What's your take on that?
Well, it's quite possible. I think we should just be open-minded and get as much data as possible. Of course, there is always the lingering suspicion that it might be another nation. Right. But as I said before, if we have enough data, we can figure it out, and we can tell if this is a plausible scenario. And the point is that you might argue, well, why would they care about us? Well, the point is that in principle, there was enough time that elapsed since most of the stars formed before the sun, billions of years ago. So if you imagine 1 billion years, during that time, you can pretty much fill up the Milky Way galaxy with probes. Even if you are one civilization, one technological civilization that is advanced enough to send probes out that have artificial intelligence with 3D printers, these probes can duplicate themselves on planets. And there is plenty of time in 1 billion years to basically fill up the Milky Way, every habitable zone. Maybe there are some probes on Mars. In principle, there could be, but you can put it on every habitable planet and just monitor what's happening. And if you have an agenda, the blueprint of these probes will be to produce some desirable result, just like the chemical that we produced against the COVID-19 virus was aimed to produce the immune response of the human body, in millions of people. So just think about the analog. You want to produce the same outcome that is desired by that civilization in billions of planets. You just decide, this is my objective, and then you put this blueprint into your AI 3D printer systems. They go to these places and they follow this blueprint. And they want to achieve this objective in a smart way. I'm not saying it's a mechanistic way. These probes could think for themselves. We have thinking machines that learn from experience, that adapt to changing circumstances, right? And they behave like intelligent beings. and they might outsmart us.
Yeah, this von Neumann probe hypothesis is incredibly interesting, because that could very well be a possibility. I just don't understand, and I don't mean to shit on Neil deGrasse Tyson, but I just don't understand this idea, because he tweeted out the other day, could you imagine why another civilization would give a crap about us? And I don't understand that way of thinking, because, you know, if you're a scientist and you're getting off planet Earth and you're going out into the universe to explore, it doesn't any form of life attract you? Isn't that why we're going to Mars? Isn't that why we're expanding our reaches around our own solar system? Because we're interested in potential other life forms. We are potential other life forms. Why wouldn't they be interested in us?
Well, they will not be interested in his tweet. That I can guarantee. Because if they care about intelligent species, this is not an intelligent tweet. Now, if we want to gain their attention, we should behave intelligently. I mean, we can behave non-intelligently like we had over human history. And the way I was asked, how do you define an intelligent culture? The way I define it is a culture or a species that follows the guiding principles of science, which are sharing evidence-based knowledge. Now, what Neil deGrasse Tyson is doing is not sharing evidence-based knowledge. He may argue that that's his opinion, but opinions do not matter in this business. You need to collect evidence. Now, if you are not aiming to collect the evidence because you have a prejudice, because you have a notion of, you are just playing lazy. You are saying, I don't need to get the evidence. It's just like the philosophers during the days of Galileo. I don't need to look through the telescope. I know the answer, but that's the wrong attitude. And by the way, I should remind everyone, it's not very expensive to get the data. So if the amount, we invested hundreds of millions of dollars in the search for dark matter. There were proposals that maybe it's weakly interacting massive particles, and therefore experiments to search for weakly interacting massive particles took place over 4 decades. We haven't found anything. Hundreds of millions of dollars were spent in that, and it's part of the mainstream of science. Now, nobody complains because that's part of science. You search in the dark, you don't always find what you want. So why is that not ridiculed? Why is deGrasse Tyson saying, we don't know the nature of dark matter. How dare you talk about weakly interacting massive particles? Extraordinary evidence before I put a cent in that direction. Why? Because it's considered socially acceptable to talk about weakly interacting massive particles.
Right.
And that is acceptable within the mainstream. So that's completely a social construct. It has nothing to do with evidence. And my point is, if we invested hundreds of millions of dollars in this direction, we should definitely invest hundreds of millions of dollars in figuring out something that Dietrich and Fravor saw and that the government issued a report about to the Congress. What are hundreds of millions of dollars in the military budget? It's nothing, it's peanuts. And we invested that in the search for dark matter of a particular type. So how can we avoid the decency of addressing this subject scientifically and getting more evidence about it? And I think that's the natural thing to do. And what I hear from scientists who, let's say, people who call themselves scientists, saying about this subject just is, completely contradictory to the spirit of exploration. Just think about the explorers that discovered the Americas. They went to India. They really didn't have the right idea, but they just went out and found something that was not expected. And of course, if there were people tweeting at that time, they would say, "Oh, what's the point in going in that direction? You don't know what's out there."
I love it. And you're absolutely right. I really appreciate you putting the exclamation point on that, because it's incredibly frustrating coming from a layman, but to see you so outspoken about it as a scientist, it's hopeful, Avi. So we appreciate what you're doing. And like in the report, it says most of the UAP reported probably do represent physical objects, given that a majority of UAP were registered across multiple sensors to include radar, infrared, electro-optical, weapon seekers, and visual observations. They're saying these things are real. They're being collected across multiple sensors. To be ignoring that is insanity.
Right. So some people argue, well, it might be the malfunction. In fact, Neil deGrasse Tyson said that it might be the malfunction of some instrument. It can't be if it's detected in multiple. And I should say, moreover, that we are seeing just the tip of the iceberg. I'm sure that there's much more data available that is much more reliable, that indicates that these are real objects, or else the report would not say that. Okay. And so you can, in principle, say, I don't believe the government. Well, my point is, this report is intriguing enough for scientists to find their own evidence. I'm not asking you to believe it. It's not religion. You're not supposed to believe it or not believe it. You're not supposed to go back in time and decide if you adapt one report or another. What you're supposed to do is say, okay, this is intriguing enough for me to go out and search for more evidence that will tell me the story, what these things are. And whatever I find will basically set the stage for our understanding of this phenomena. And I should say that, if we leave the situation as is, if scientists ridicule the subject and the public is intrigued and that fuels speculation, that's a very unhealthy state of affairs to have in the 21st century. We went a long way since the Dark Ages. I would expect us to learn the lesson that, science can clear up the fog in situations where we don't have enough evidence to make definitive statements. And if it costs less than the amount of money that was allocated to the search for dark matter, let's just invest that money. And if the government is not willing to invest that money, there are lots of wealthy individuals, some of whom I spoke with in recent days.
That's fantastic. Who are you speaking with?
I cannot say.
It was worth a shot.
Let's put it this way: if the initiative will materialize, you will hear about it.
I very much look forward to hearing about it. Let me ask you this, Avi. I'm happy with the way the report broke this phenomenon down into 5 buckets. I think that one of the problems, and maybe this is where a lot of the confusion comes in when it comes to the mainstream attitude towards the subject. People use words like the phenomenon, and I think the problem with that is you're putting everything into one massive bucket when lots of things have different outcomes, different solutions. So in the UAP report, they identified 5 buckets: airborne clutter, atmospheric phenomenon, USG or US industry, developmental programs, foreign adversary systems, and then a catch-all other bin. In your opinion, from a scientific or data analysis perspective, are they close here? Are they on spot, or do they need to do some work here?
No, I think the fundamental buckets that should have been defined are, well, once you agree that they are real, okay? So that, of course, is the first issue. Are they real? And if you say they are real, there are 2 buckets, not 5. The 2 buckets are human-made or something else, okay? Now, the something else splits into 2 parts, either natural or artificial, okay? Now, if it's not human-made, which you can pretty much clear up, just like Sherlock Holmes, you are excluding possibilities. Okay, first thing is to figure out that it's real. And that was already decided, I think, by the report. Yeah. Okay, so if it's real, then next step, it's like a tree. You go to the next step. The next step is to figure out whether it's human-made. Okay, and that we can figure out based on what it does, what these objects do. And compare that to what we are capable of doing. Anyone in the US, we pretty much know, because otherwise, suppose there was a company that is able to maneuver like that, they would have a contract with the DoD and get billions of dollars for that. Yeah, I mean, if it's completely doing something completely crazy, Okay, so we can pretty much know what's going on within our nation. And then the question is, could it be another nation? And for that, we have intelligence, right? So I'm saying, okay, I trust our intelligence. I think it's first class. And I would argue that the political system pretty much knows if it's another nation, okay? But let's put it this way. If it happens to be another nation and we didn't suspect, that would be a huge revelation, okay? So let's say we believe our intelligence, because I don't have access to the classified information, but suppose there is enough data to convince us that it cannot be another nation, because we know what the other nations are doing. We are seeing it, we are monitoring it, there is some intelligence about their technologies. It's not, I mean, we are not that ignorant about what other nations are doing.
Right.
So if we exclude that possibility, we could potentially exclude the possibility that it's human-made. Okay, so we move to the next bifurcation point. So then there are two options. Either it's natural or artificial. Natural means nature makes something we haven't expected. It's not a bird. It cannot be a bird because a bird would be recognized. It cannot be a fly. It cannot be something that is obvious. These pilots would not declare a bird as an object that moves in some strange ways. Okay. Anyway, so it could be a natural. I'm not excluding that a priori. I'm saying it could be natural, but then it would be something we've never witnessed or never expected. And by itself, that would be very good to know, because otherwise it fools you. If something happens in nature that you haven't expected, you should know about it, okay? Because when you decide about missions, you should know that there could be an object flying close to you that will damage your airplane. And there was one of these objects that came very close to a collision, So you need to know about it. It's part of reality. You need to be aware of what reality presents so that you are assessing the risks in any mission. So we need to know about it. And if it happens not to be natural, that it's artificial, then of course it tells us that it came from another technological civilization, which would be very dramatic. So I'm saying we can go down this path, and that's the logical way, rather than having 5 categories and putting it in one bin or another. Let's just move along this path, which basically excludes, that's what Sherlock Holmes said. If you exclude all possibility, whatever remains must be the truth, right? So let's act as a detective. We are excluding possibilities, and whatever remains, if whatever remains is an extraterrestrial technology, it must be the truth. Now, we can verify that that's the case by taking a high resolution photograph.
Right.
What's suspected. So then we put a lot of resources, get that photograph, and let Neil deGrasse Tyson tweet about it.
I think that's the key, right? Like getting this out of the domain purely of the military and bringing it into the hands of scientists. But what kind of pushback are you getting, Avi? Like you're the only one I hear out here talking like this from the mainstream academia. When you're in your element, what are you hearing from your colleagues? Are they willing to discuss this other than the tweeters?
Well, I should say that I get an amazing response from the public and wealthy individuals that want to do this line of research, and that make that I'm very encouraged by that. It means that I thought that I have to look for intelligence in the sky because I cannot find it here on Earth. But what I should say is there are signs of intelligence here on Earth as well. Natural intelligence by people that see the light and recognize the fact that science is the only path forward, and rather than ridiculing and eliminating possibilities just based on prejudice, the way for us to understand something about reality is to collect evidence. That's the way traditionally that science made progress by, and we should have learned that. And it's fun, by the way. It's exciting. Why should we be depressed all the time and say, "Oh, nothing"? There is nothing new under the sun, as was said a long time ago. There could be something new under the sun if you're open to possibilities. And the only reason there would be nothing new under the sun is if you assume that there is nothing new under the sun and never look out.
And you don't look, and that's the problem. Are you familiar with SkyHub? It's an AI technology, and one of the things that I would be fascinated by, and what I would love to do, is to get these units into schools, and so you could be teaching kids science. They could be learning an incredible amount while tracking the skies, and I know there would be so many civilian supporters of yours, Avi, if this wealthy individual comes through and gives you an opportunity to lead this hunt for UAP, because we could, there's so much crowdsourcing that can be done here. I know so many people who would give their left arm to help you in this process.
Let me correct you. It's not one individual. it's more.
That's great. That's great.
And that reinforces the point that a lot of them think similarly. It's several. It's not just one. And the point is that I think, the reason I wrote my book, Extraterrestrial, was to encourage young people to think outside the box, to be open-minded, because eventually they will occupy the halls of academia. And if you think about the French Revolution, for example, you won't expect Marie Antoinette to embrace the principles of the French Revolution. She said, let them have cakes. Obviously, she was not embracing the principles because she benefited from the old system.
Yes.
And as a result, if you want to change the guiding principles of humanity, you want the young people that have no prejudice, that are not attached to their ego as much as the senior people, to eventually change the culture. And that's the audience that I'm targeting with my book, with everything I say. And by the way, it's not a matter of age. In 2013, January, I gave a lecture at a winter school in Jerusalem about how exciting is a new frontier of gravitational wave astrophysics. Okay, and 10 minutes into my talk, another lecturer in that winter school stood up, and he is 20 years younger than I am, and he said, "How dare you waste the time of these students?" He said it in front of them. "How dare you waste the time of these students on a subject that will never be important during their careers?" He said that, and it's on video. And just 2.5 years later, the LIGO experiment discovered the first gravitational wave source. These students were not at the end of their career. They were still doing their PhD. Wow. So just think about it. He was saying how important that would be in their career. And then while they were still pursuing their PhD, this became the hottest frontier in astrophysics. And the Nobel Prize was awarded a few years ago to this subject. And this person in 2013 was telling me to shut down my lecture, to basically shut up and not talk about it because it's a waste of time. So I ask you, and I was obviously a tenured professor at Harvard, first of all, how can someone 20 years younger than me tell me not to speak about the subject in front of all the students? But moreover, how can that person be so wrong?
Avi, that's absolutely shocking that in this day and age, you have people who are so uninterested in having these conversations in the halls of academia. Like, I'm shocked.
Well, that's the reality. And by the way, academia was constructed in a way to encourage free thought and risk-taking, because it established...
Let me ask you this. What incentives have changed? Because you're right, academia was built for this. It was built for intellectual curiosity. How has the incentivization changed so dramatically?
Yeah, so the tenure system was constructed such that people will not have to worry about job security when they talk about non-conventional truths that they believe in. And instead, when people get tenure, most of them are worried about their image. They check how many likes they get on Twitter, and they basically try to satisfy the community so that people in selection committees will give them prizes, awards, admit them to honorary societies. And if that's your objective, basically you subscribe to groupthink, and you don't take any risks because you want to protect your image. And aside from being conservative, another side effect is if your community decides that some, untested hypothesis is interesting, like, for example, extra dimensions, the multiverse, the landscape of string theory. If you have a group of people, all of which decide this is an interesting subject to explore, even if there is no experimental test, it's actually a very convenient sandbox to demonstrate how smart you are without putting any skin in the game, without taking risks that you might be wrong. When Einstein made the statement that quantum mechanics cannot have spooky action at a distance, that was a statement that he suggested an experiment to test. It's called the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen experiment, and that experiment was done and showed that he was wrong. But instead, if you're talking about extra dimensions and saying, I don't really care whether it will be tested, I just want to do mathematical gymnastics and demonstrate that I'm smart, and then your colleagues give you prizes and awards and recognition and so forth, and everyone agrees that's okay, that's legitimate, and even one philosopher made a statement in a lecture that he gave at the Black Hole Initiative saying, physics is whatever physicists do. If a group of physicists for 10 years decides to work on something, that must be the truth. And I said, no, it has to be to agree with experimental tests. It may be completely off. How can you say that if a group of people agrees on something, it must be the truth? The point is, evidence is the key. But it's very convenient to be in a corner where you don't put any skin in the game. You don't make predictions that can be proven wrong. And you have that culture right now in many aspects of theoretical physics. And I find that to be unhealthy. And also, the fact that the academic community doesn't pay attention to the interests of the public. If the public says, this subject is of great interest to us, academia couldn't care less. To me, it sounds more like being focused on how many angels can sit on the tip of a pin as an intellectually stimulating question that people can get tenure on if they address it. And what we really should be after is addressing issues of interest to the general public, because the public funds science. At the very least, we should not ignore or ridicule these issues, these lines of investigation. And we should invest as much money in the search for technological relics as we invest in the search for dark matter. Why would we think that dark matter search is more important? It has very little impact on the daily lives of people, whereas if we find technological relics, it would have a huge impact on society.
Right. I mean, I have a lot of respect for theoretical physics, but at a certain point, a lot of this seems like a bunch of guys gathered around a chalkboard, patting each other on the back and worshiping elegant math. Like, I don't quite, understand why we're spending billions on string theory and we can barely get data on things that are going on in our own world.
Well, we don't spend billions because it's still a theoretical subject, but the point is we spend a lot of attention on this subject. And I have nothing against mathematical sophistication. That many times nature is subtle and you need very fancy math to explain it. The issue is whether your predictions are testable. And let me illustrate that with an example. Bernie Madoff told people that if they give him money, he will make more money out of it and give them back more. And that was a beautiful idea. They were very happy giving him the money. He was very happy that they gave him the money. Everyone was happy. So what's bad about it? The bad part of it is when you do a test, an experimental test, at some point they ask for their money back. That is the experiment, okay? Before that, it was a happy idea that everyone was happy thinking about. And when they did the experiment, the end of that was to put him in jail, because this experiment turned out to show that his theory was wrong. Now, that is exactly how science should be done, that we should test our ideas. They could be as beautiful as you might imagine. Aristotle's idea of us being at the center of the universe was a beautiful idea. He had those spheres centered on us for 1,000 years. It flattered the ego of many people, so they believed him. Then Galileo, Copernicus came along and said, no, actually, it looks like the Earth moves around the sun. People were very angry at that notion because they still wanted to be at the center of the universe.
Right.
So it was the beautiful idea that they were after, and they punished those that betrayed the beautiful idea. But it so happens that it was wrong. So here is my point. Bernie Madoff was wrong in suggesting a beautiful idea. And the only way to find out is by doing the experiment. And we should pay more respect to evidence than we pay to beautiful ideas.
Absolutely. Well said. And thank you for what you're doing. I think it's so incredibly important. I've stolen you for an extra 10 minutes. So I just wanted to thank you so much for your time today. Being here means a lot to me. It means a lot to the folks listening. And I think you're restoring a lot of people's faith in academia, to be honest with you. So that's something we really appreciate here.
Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. Avi, have a wonderful day. Make sure you go check out Avi's book, Extraterrestrial. Maybe you can find it in an actual real physical bookstore instead of Amazon. Good luck with that. And Avi, thank you so much. You're a great friend of the show, and we look forward to having you back.
It was a great pleasure, and I hope to report back if we find more evidence.
I'm excited. I'm excited about these folks you're talking to. I can't wait. All right. Thank you so much, Avi. Have a wonderful day. And for those of you still here, stick around with me for another couple minutes. I've got a special surprise guest here in the back. We've got the head science writer from The Debrief here with me, Christopher Plain. Christopher Plain, welcome.
Michael, what's happening? Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you great, brother. It's great to have you. You got a... Woo! You got a killer article that came out today.
Well, if you don't mind, let me give a little background before we jump into that. But yeah, basically, when I joined the Debrief a little over 6 months ago, I came on as a science writer. They have plenty of guys covering UFO and UAP, and they brought me on to talk about science. So that's what I've been doing. A couple of weeks ago, the new head of NASA, Bill Nelson, back on June 7th, I was writing an article about these new Venus missions, and he was in a press conference, and just someone offhandedly asked him, "Hey, what's your attitude on the UAP report and the UFOs and all this?" And he kind of said, like, "I'm going to put NASA on the job. I'm going to have scientists look into it." And so the bosses at the Debriefer reached out to me and said, "This is your beat. You're the guy that talks to NASA all the time. Put this out."
You get your UAP.
So I started doing the research and I put that first piece out, right? So I thought I was good. I'm in. I got my UFO story. Back to writing about science. I'm good, right?
Right.
So we skip ahead to the weekend. Everything went crazy on Friday. I even jumped in and hammered out a little article in the middle of the fray. And on Sunday, I got a message. I think it was from you. It might have been Luis, but I got a message about there was this new page on the NASA website, this free FAQ page talking about how they're going to deal with it. So my bosses said, "Yeah, go ahead and write a follow-up to the piece you did before." So I reach out to you late that night, and I said, "Mike, I need a mainstream scientist to come on to give me an attitude about, like, great, NASA's involved, that's great, but how does science as a community feel about it as opposed to this select group at NASA?" So you said, "Hey, Chris, here's Abel Mendez's email address, reach out to him." And then, of course, we've talked to Abel before. I've written a couple of features on him. And I reached out to him, and I went to bed, hey, we'll see what he has to say. So I wake up the next day. Bill Nelson at that point had gone on CNN, right? He had and he pretty much said, like, it's aliens, right? He said, it's not Russia, it's not China, it's not us. And so I start expanding my article. I start adding that. Oh, holy shit, NASA, pardon my French, but NASA is really doing this. They're really putting their scientists to this problem. So I've got my article done, and as the night is coming through, Abel Mendez reaches back out to me, and he gives me a couple of pretty regular quotes about, hey, science and UFOs, and we don't really do that here. And then he gave me the big enchilada, right? He said, "Look, if NASA doesn't, if this classified data isn't made available to scientists, we're not going to be any help. We can't give you," exactly what Avi just said. "Without data, we're wasting our time." And so I put that out. It popped out today, and I know it's blown up on Twitter. I know it's blown up on the site, but I think we've turned a corner here. I think that article at the Debrief and what you're talking about here on Singularity, I think we've turned a corner, man. I think science is taking this thing seriously for the first time in my lifetime, and I'm in my 50s, and this is the first time I've seen it.
Right. You've got somebody like, Abel Mendez willing to go on record to say, look, if you're not going to bother giving us the classified data, don't even ask for our help. Like, that's
right. Hey, Mike, when I met my wife many years ago, she's a lawyer and an arbitrator, and she deals with facts, man. She deals with facts and evidence. And she told me, if testimonial evidence way outweighs physical evidence, that disparity is a problem. And in the UFO community, it's what we've lived with. That's why we have the McWest, because we have tons of anecdotal evidence. We have really respectable fighter pilots, commercial pilots. Edgar Mitchell talking about an incident in the 50s when he's in his fighter jet. Amazing situations. But that evidence, those photos, the videos throughout my lifetime have always been this kind of subpar stuff.
Yep.
Well, now we know within this group, within what the military has seen and within what NASA, hopefully it sounds like is going to get a chance to look at, there's some there might be some goods in there. There might be some, what did Bob McGuire say? 40 minutes of science fiction movie? Right?
Yeah, about the classified report.
Who knows if he knows anybody or has really talked to anybody? I don't know. But to hear that these legislators and now NASA scientists are going to have 40 minutes of, hopefully objects displaying the observables, not a go fast that could be a balloon or, a FLIR video that might be the Tic Tac, but might just be something blurry. I have my own opinions on gimbal. I think that's a pretty good piece of video, and I think there's a good argument for that. But those are all gray area discussions still. Those are all videos that hit the world a couple of years ago, blew us all up, and may have prosaic explanations.
Right. And what Avi just said it. He's like, we need clear imagery. We need to do it ourselves. We need to stop relying on the government. And that's one of the things that I think is so important. Like, if we're expecting government disclosure, like put on your earmuffs and head out of the room for a second, because that's not going to fucking happen. Yeah. What we need is science studying these things and getting clear imagery for the people, as opposed to waiting on the government to deem us ready.
I think that's a good point. In 1952, we were at a point where science was looking at this seriously. Whether you want to go Foo Fighters in the end of World War II, end of 44, or Kenneth Arnold in 47, there were enough incidents, and back then, enough what looked like potentially legitimate photos and videos and things, that the military looked at this in an eerie similarity to what we're hearing now. And if you watch it, there's a documentary that's on YouTube. It's called UFO, came out in 1956, and it pretty much covers what happened from 47 to 52 in the Air Force. They were looking at this stuff and they were going, it's not Russia, it's not ours. And the end of that movie, that documentary, is the guy looking to the sky and saying that only leaves one option. And I think we've come around. In 1952, we hadn't been on the moon before. We hadn't even sent a satellite in space. We didn't have rovers on Mars. And we sure as hell didn't know there were planets around other stars. That didn't happen until I was an adult in the 1990s. And now we have so much data that we're not 1952. We're 2021. And this society is ready to hear and see evidence. And I think we're ready. I think we're ready to look at that. I think regardless of the consequences, if there's 40 minutes of sci-fi footage, if there's triangle photos and tic-tac photos and all of these things, it's time. We know they have it. We now know they have it. Elizondo told you on your interview, he said there's much more high-def video. There's much better photos. This isn't something we're wondering if it exists. We know it exists. Now that we know it's there, it's a matter of time before we see it.
Well said. For those of you who want to check out Christopher Plain's article at the Debrief, what's the title of the article, Chris?
Oh, how would I know?
Just type in thedebrief.org. You'll find it's on the front page.
It's the cover article today. It's right on the debrief.org. It is the cover article. It has to do with NASA, and it has to do with call from mainstream scientists. I mean, guys like Tyson, deGrasse Tyson, guys like Seth Shostak, these guys that have been critical, they have grounds to be critical. I think as a guy, I talk to NASA scientists every day. I talk to science people all day, every day. That is my job. And they are in that show me the evidence category. I can tell you this, though, Mike. I can tell you when I talk to young astrobiologists, young astronomers, physicists, we are not in 1952 anymore. These people all tell me privately that to their mind, it's a foregone conclusion that there's life on other planets. Right. It's a foregone conclusion. The vastness of the universe, the commonality of the minerals and the
galaxy that we're in alone. Planets, right.
Yeah. There's no doubt that we're talking about life. So all we're really talking about is traveling interstellar distances. 120 years ago, we couldn't fly across the Atlantic. If you wanted to go to Europe, you had to take a boat for 3 months or whatever. Now we can fly to Mars.
Well, you also did
for 40 years. It's outside the solar system.
Right. You also did
200 years from now, we can't go to TRAPPIST.
Right, right. And you did an amazing article as well about theoretical warp drive technology too. So that's fantastic. For those of you who haven't subscribed yet, I don't know what you're doing. Make sure you subscribe to the channel if you love content like this. Make sure you go check out Chris at The Debrief. Chris is also going to be joining us next Tuesday for a full-length interview, and I'm looking forward to that, Chris.
Yeah, I have a lot more thoughts. I have a lot of things I'm going to share with you. Then I saw you were having Avi on today. And I had that article out today, and I said, this is a corner that's been waiting to be turned my entire life. I can tell you in 2001, after Greer and after the big press conference and everything, I was out of this subject. I've been following it my whole life, and I went, that's it. If pilots will come out and say it's happening, if military people will come out and say it's happening, and the government still is not going to look into it, my wife is right. There's a bunch of anecdotal evidence and no physical evidence. Well, now we know. There's physical evidence. We know of 80 cases with radar and so forth. And I agree with Avi. They don't need to all be alien craft. In reality, I don't think anyone thinks. Is there any UFO enthusiast out there that goes, 144 UAP, they're all aliens? I think we all take that attitude that there's misidentified craft, misidentified planets, atmospheric phenomena. I think everybody feels that way. But I do think enough people hear enough cases about things that just don't add up, that seem like physical, real, pardon me for being an old man, but unidentified flying objects. Okay? Not phenomena. I think that's great. I think it's great the military has their own term. But I talked to pilots when I was a kid. When I first learned about this stuff, I had friends whose parents were pilots, and this is what I would ask them. Hey, have you ever seen a UFO? Have you seen it flying around? And some would smile and give me no answer, and others would say, well, I know pilots that have.
Right.
And this is the reality. It's what I told my wife at the time. I said, do I know if people are getting abducted by aliens? I have no idea. Do I think cattle are being mutilated or aliens are drawing fancy designs and crops or any of that? I have no thought, but here's what I can tell you with a pretty fair degree of confidence. Shit's flying around. It's doing stuff that's not supposed to do. It's behaving in ways it really shouldn't behave for our understanding. And it's probably not us. It sure feels like it's not us.
Right.
With all of that being said, I will say, I still never rule out that it is secret U.S. military technology. And here's why, Michael.
What about dolphin technology? No? You're not
right?
thinking?
Well, see, now I'll get into that next week with you when I'm on for a long form.
Yeah, let's get it. We'll also, I want to get into the potential U.S. technology as well, but let's do that next week. I do need to wrap it up here. We've got an amazing show tonight as well, Chris. We're going to be, we've got the Unidentified Celebrity View.
I'll be writing for the debrief. Big stuff coming over there. Let me tell you, a lot of cool stuff coming.
And you're gonna leak it to us next Tuesday, yeah? And you're gonna tell us you got a triangle video or something over there? No.
Here's what I'll tell you, Mike, before you let me go. I told them when they hired me at the debrief, if anyone here ever gives me the triangle photo or a dispositive video like that, you might as well fire me because I'll tweet it immediately. Society needs to know if I'm the asshole that suddenly has that picture and I have the ability to put it out to the world, I'll deal with the consequences. They're never giving me that photo. I can tell you right now, I'll never see that shit.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Chris, for playing. We'll see you next Tuesday. Join us tonight on UCR for Sean Reich, Witness Citizen. He's going to be joining us. And we're also going to be doing season 2, episode 8, I believe, reviewing that of Skinwalker Ranch. So join us for that as well. Chris, have a great one, brother.
You too, Mike. Good to see you, brother. Love you, man.
You too. Love you, man. Later. All right. Thank you guys so much for checking us out here at the Singularity Lab. If you want to help the show, if you want to support the show, make sure you click the Patreon link below. You can give a monthly donation. We definitely appreciate it here. It keeps the show running. And anything you guys can do to continue supporting the show is always appreciated. So thank you so much. Make sure you subscribe below. And you guys all rock. Thank you for being here today. I appreciate it.